Hello, everyone. Today is November 4th, 2022. My name is Anna D'Souza. I'm an associate professor at the Mark School. I'm very happy to welcome all of you here for a special event, which is an inclusive teaching event, as well as one of our DEI Fridays, which are hosted by the Mark School. I am the Provost Innovation Fellow for Inclusive Teaching, and I am really pleased to be here with you this afternoon to learn with you in community about trauma-informed pedagogy. So here is the agenda for today. This is a wonderful website that Sika has put together that she's also dropped in the chat. This kind of tells you a little bit about what we're thinking about today in terms of Sika and I putting together this program for you. I'll read this initial quote on the website by Bell Hooks in her book, Teaching to Transgress. Any radical pedagogy must insist that everyone's presence is acknowledged. That insistence cannot simply be stated. It has to be demonstrated through pedagogical practices. To begin, the professor must genuinely value everyone's presence and their active, I would add to, participation in the class, which may look different for each student. So as I mentioned, we are going to start off now. We're running a little bit late, but that's okay because we built in time for that. So we are going to have the first panel, Understanding Trauma, with Jael Amador, who's at the student she's a student psychological counselor here at the Baruch Counseling Center. She's going to be in conversation with Daphna Ziffer, who's one of our master's students in psychology department. Then where Sika is going to talk to you about the resource guide that she's put together that is very useful and has great information for faculty and staff, as well as students in learning and thinking about trauma and how we can approach those with trauma in the spaces that we're in. And then the second panel will be on trauma-informed education and pedagogy, and that'll be with Jean Amaral from the Borough of Manhattan Community College. She is an associate professor and open knowledge librarian, and she will be in conversation with Stanji Vicht. I will work on that before I introduce you, Stanzi. And she is another psychology student doing her master's here at Baruch. So I just wanted to show that to you. And we will begin now with the first conversation. I'm very pleased to introduce Daphna Ziffer. She is a graduate student at Baruch's Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, where she's getting her master's in mental health counseling. She went to the Stern College for Women to do her bachelor's degree, where she majored in psychology and got an associate's degree as well in Judaic studies. She's originally from Maryland and came to New York for college and has enjoyed spending time with friends, exploring New York, and making the city her new home. Welcome, Daphne. We're so happy for you to be here with us and in conversation with Dr. Jael Amador.
Thank you, Anna. I am honored to introduce Dr. Jael Amador. Dr. Jael Amador is a New York State licensed psychologist who provides individual and group therapy supervision, crisis intervention, and outreach services at the Baruch College Counseling Center. Her clinical approach integrates cognitive behavioral therapy and trauma-informed care with feminist multicultural theory to treat a wide range of issues. She currently co-leads the trauma-informed peer supervision group for counseling center staff, as well as teaches seminars on trauma-informed care and resiliency for the counseling center training class. Dr. Amador earned her doctorate degree from Loma Linda University, where she specialized in sociocultural behavioral health. In her research, she explores the impact of culture on psychological processes and behavior. She currently serves as a member of the International Behavioral Health Trauma Team and the APA Health Equity Ambassadors Program. Dr. Amador, can you please define trauma for us?
Thank you, Daphna. Yes, of course. So I'm going to share my screens to help facilitate this definition. And I also want to start off by saying that some of these topics are really difficult. Trauma is very personal. And so I just want to echo Anna's statement to let's take care of ourselves if we need to. But first, when we define trauma, it's important to understand what a traumatic event is. And a traumatic event is an experience where we feel a sense of fear, helplessness, or horror that's so overwhelming or that's so intense that it overwhelms our ability to cope with it. So in essence, we are able as human beings to cope with fear, to cope with helplessness, to cope with difficult things, but when we are traumatized, those things are overwhelmed. And so psychological trauma, in essence, is a unique individual experience of a traumatic event, or serious events, or a set of enduring circumstances in which we're not able to integrate our emotional experience because our emotional experience is overwhelmed, and we experience a subjective threat to life, bodily integrity, or sanity. Now, in terms of our response to traumatic events or to trauma in general, these are incredibly unique to the individual. If you can kind of think about us as New Yorkers, how we may have experienced 9/11 versus someone who watched it on CNN in California, right? Those are two very different experiences. And one of the best ways that I've learned to kind of like describe how trauma differs for everyone is to think about leaving a child alone at home, right? And if a child is 15 years old, they'll be able to take care of themselves. They'll probably love being home alone. They'll be able to eat. They'll be able to keep themselves safe if there's danger. If a child is 5 years old, right, they might not be able to do those things. They might be able to maybe feed themselves, maybe run away, but they'll still be a really difficult time for them. And if a child is 5 months old, that'll be too overwhelming for them and they won't have the capacity to cope, right? So just in essence, trauma is when our ability to cope with a stressor or with danger is overwhelmed, that our capacity to cope with those things don't really work anymore. And that's how we experience trauma.
Thank you. Would you be able to then clarify what's the difference between stress and trauma?
Absolutely. So as we all know, stress is a normal part of life. And it becomes intensified when we enter college, right? So if we think about our students, we think about them maybe separating from their parents for the first time, coping with new financial stressors, managing work that's very different from high school. But we have, like I said before, a capacity to deal with different types of stressors. And that capacity tends to come from our nervous system and the way that kind of our nervous system adjusts to our environment. So I just wanted to share this. Our autonomic nervous system kind of helps us to naturally cope with stress by helping things like our heart rate, our breathing, our muscle tension, our blood pressure, things that we don't have to think about to modulate to help us deal with stress, right? So if we are thinking about taking a test, right, our heart rate might go up, our breathing might increase, but it will increase to a level that will kind of help us take care of ourselves. And then when things go back to normal, we tend to kind of like modulate back into a more relaxed state. And so stress is kind of when a normal part of life, when we feel pressure, but we're able to cope with it. Now, when it comes to trauma happens when all of these things are overwhelmed, right? And like, even when our heart rate goes up, even when our breathing goes up and our muscle tension increases, we're not really able to withstand the stressor or the danger that's in front of us. And our fight or flight mechanism essentially doesn't work. And so when we've experienced a traumatic event, in subsequent stressful events, we may not be able to cope with those stressful events in the same way that we would have under normal circumstances, because our capacity to cope with them are overwhelmed.
Thank you. What are different sources of trauma that one might experience?
Yeah, so I love this question because at the Counseling Center, we like to think about trauma at a really in a holistic way, right? We often talk about individual and interpersonal trauma, but there are also different sources of trauma that include community trauma as well as institutional and societal trauma. So I'll go through these just really briefly. When we think about trauma in the ways that we're more familiar with, we often think about individual trauma, which could include health trauma or medical trauma, stigma related to health and medical trauma, mental health trauma, and incarceration trauma, or any sort of like personal accident or fires or car accidents or natural disaster that we as an individual may experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope with them. We also tend to talk about interpersonal trauma. This is when one person may hurt another person, where we might have traumatic loss or abuse or neglect history. And this also includes sexual assault, stalking, intimate partner violence, and microaggressions. So interpersonal or familial trauma involves one person and more than one person, where there's individual trauma involves the individual, obviously. And also there's also community trauma in terms of ways in which our communities are built so that we're not able to cope with the stressors within that community. So things like community violence, school violence, immigration and cultural assimilation, and what encompasses all of that is institutional trauma. So things like systemic oppression, chronic poverty and homelessness, war, terrorism, the way that we view folks and treat refugees. And one of the ways that we like to look at it at the Counseling Center is the belief that all trauma is institutional and societal trauma, right? So if we think about how these can overlap, and if we think about how the way that subcommunities are built have to do with the way that we as a society view certain folks, particularly folks from marginalized society, right? The folks who are more, who have perhaps more violence towards them are often the folks that we as a society tend to marginalize and deem as less than, right? So when we think about trauma, we can't think about it outside of the context of how our society views folks and how our society is built to only protect a certain subset of folks and not protect others.
So it sounds like there are a lot of different sources of trauma that people are able to experience, maybe these 4 different sections that we spoke about. How is trauma able to affect the individual?
Yeah, so I wanted to share this graphic, and this is called the window of tolerance. So when we were talking about stress, we were talking about how our fight or flight mechanism can help us in our everyday life to cope with different stressors, right? So if you think about waking up during the day, right? Perhaps you missed your alarm and you might feel a little bit more anxious, right? And you might kind of go into your fight or flight mechanism. But then you're able to make it to class, you feel a little bit more relaxed. Maybe you connect with with a friend, maybe you almost missed your train or something happens that might scare you. And so you might notice that in terms of your arousal, right? Whether you are in fight or flight or in feed or breathe, that can go up or down throughout the course of your day. When we experience trauma, what's called our window of tolerance or our optimal zone for our fight or flight to be in, that window shortens, and then we can potentially become something called hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused. When we're hyper-aroused, that means that our capacity to cope is so overwhelmed that we become a little keyed up. We may become emotionally overwhelmed, experience panic or impulsivity. We may have some hypervigilance, defensiveness, and we might feel unsafe or reactive. On the other end, could be hypoarousal. This is when we can experience numbness, passivity, shame, and disconnection, right? So when it comes to an individual experience of trauma, right, or how it presents itself in the individual, our capacity for coping not only did not work in that traumatic event or series of events, but our window of tolerance shortens so that when we are stressed out or when stress kind of happens to us, it overwhelms our systems continuously as we keep going.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier that the start of college could be a very stressful time for students, but we're also talking about trauma. So I wanted to ask, how does trauma show up for our students here at Baruch?
Yeah, so let's think, if we think about trauma as potentially showing up as hyperarousal, right? Being keyed up or being agitated or panicked, or hypoarousal, being numb or passive or having no energy, we can think about how that plays out within the classroom. So some things that we can kind of think about in terms of hyperarousal and hypoarousal are the impact of trauma on learning, right? So when a person is stressed, their stress response can be activated. It can impact the way that they're able to focus, right? Whether they're hyperaroused, they're in so much panic, they can't really focus on the task at hand, or hypoaroused, where they're so disconnected that they can't really understand what is really happening in front of them and therefore unable to focus. This also could impact how our students can attend to information, how they're able to retain information and recall information, which are all important aspects of learning. A person's stress response can also be activated around deadlines or public speaking because it may have to do with trauma related to relationships, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But this could lead to missed deadlines, dissociations, or feelings of helplessness. And it can also affect how a person learns, right? If we're so afraid of the world that we get overwhelmed and we're not able to cope with being in the world, we might kind of reduce our curiosity and might inhibit our ability to explore the world and learn new things because we're so preoccupied with keeping ourselves safe. Trauma can also impact the way that we relate to other people, right? So if we're thinking about how it can affect our social functionings, perhaps it can affect our relationship with our peers, with our mentors, with our professors. And if we're either so overwhelmed or so passive or disconnected in class, we might not participate in class or group discussions. It might be difficult to ask for help because that's either overwhelming or we don't have the energy to do so. We might not approach professors or teachers or anyone for any sort of opportunities, whether they be research opportunities. That we may actually have students who, rather than kind of avoiding us as teachers or professors or staff members, they may assume that we're a place of closeness and safety, but to an appropriate degree, and so kind of feel an inappropriate sense of closeness with us, and maybe have trouble honoring boundaries. So trying to call us outside of office hours or in the middle of the night, or assuming that we can kind of check emails at 2 o'clock in the morning. And it can also impact our behaviors, our students' behaviors. So when we think about trauma, and we think about trauma in terms of safety, right? If we think that the world is unsafe and we start to re-experience unsafety within the world, of course, we're going to try to protect ourselves. And how we try to protect ourselves may look hostile to other people, may look difficult to other people, may look like we're trying to resist authority or are reluctant to trust, right? And so we may interact with the student in a way that that reminds the student of either a traumatic experience or a traumatic relationship that they may have had. And so we may want to start to think about our students' behavior, particularly if they get in the way of their work, if they're bothersome to us, if they feel like they're hostile or difficult. We may want to start to think about how that could be either hypoarousal or hyperarousal, and that may help us adjust or change the ways in which we deal with them or communicate with them.
Thank you. So my final question is, how does trauma differ from depression and anxiety? These all sound slightly similar, and I know that in my own college experience, I definitely had friends that were exhibiting symptoms that sound quite similar.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to share so that I can answer that question. So when we think about depression and anxiety, we often are talking about specific diagnoses. The most common or the most known actually diagnosis for depression is major depressive disorder, and the most known is for anxiety is generalized anxiety disorder. Depression is characterized by sadness or low moods that impacts our functioning and our ability to do things, and anxiety is characterized by fear that impacts our functioning. Now, there are multiple contributing factors to depression and anxiety, right? Depression and anxiety can be contributed by past experiences, by our relationship with our parents, by numerous things, right? Trauma can also be one of those things that contributes to a diagnosis of depression and anxiety. So when we think about depression and anxiety, we think specifically about diagnoses and these different symptoms that are characterized either by sadness or by anxiety. And when we think about trauma, we think about it as a contributing factor to depression and anxiety, and trauma can also contribute to other diagnoses, for example, substance abuse disorders, PTSD, eating disorders, etc. So in that way that they differ, right? The depression and anxiety are the diagnoses, whereas trauma is a contributing factor to these diagnoses.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amador. It was so nice getting to talk with you and learn more about this topic together.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jael. I think I can call you Jael, my friend and colleague. And thank you, Daphna, for that. I had not put in the chat yet, but let me just invite our participants right now to put some questions in the chat. Dr. Amador will be with us for a little while. So if you have questions, that was a lot of information. We decided that we wanted to start with this, start with the trauma focus versus the pedagogy focus, because, these definitions, these terms are used a lot. People talk about, are we traumatizing our students in the classroom? Are people being re-traumatized? They use a lot of these words, right? And I just wanted to really thank you, Dr. Amador, for giving us that baseline to make sure that we understand, when we're using the word in this context of trauma-informed pedagogy today, as we continue the discussion, what we mean, and I particularly appreciate the description of trauma at the individual level all the way to the institutional and systemic level. And I think that here at CUNY, many of our students, staff, and faculty as well, many people in New York City, especially now, I think it's fair to say after COVID, that there are many people who have experienced trauma, and it's probably being underdiagnosed, as many mental illnesses are. So I just really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to invite my wonderful graduate assistant, who is very much a creator of today's teach-in and all the other teach-ins that we've done. So Sika, please take it away. Please show them everything that you've put together on our website and with the resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor D'Souza, and thank you, Dr. Amador and Daphna for starting us off. A lot of what you heard talked about, you're going to see in the resource guide. So I'm going to just drop that in the chat for everyone right now. If you are able to click on the link and join me on our website, that would be great. Not a lot there, so it's very easy. Tried to make it very easier and user-friendly to navigate, but just kind of wanted to walk you through some of the resources that are available for you to follow up with this teach-in even after we're done today. And so on the final tab under resource guide, you will see a link to a PDF document. If you scroll to the bottom, you can download a copy for yourself to your desktop, or if you wanted to print it out, or just be able to not have to be online to see it. We will probably keep updating this as we get new information and as things change. And so definitely bookmark this website, and you can come back to it whenever you have a moment to see any updates. But in this resource guide, and I apologize, I just realized I didn't make a table of contents. So I'm going to go back and update that. But you'll see lots of resources starting where we started today, right? And just kind of some definitions about what is trauma. What should you be looking for? How would you define it for yourself, for others? And so you'll see some resources about definitions, about different types of trauma, and how you can recognize. You'll see some of the same images that Dr. Amador just shared with us. We'll talk about who experiences trauma and how it manifests in higher education. There's been a lot of research about trauma-informed education from the elementary to secondary school, but now higher ed is really starting to pay attention to it as well, especially with all of the things that have been happening in the country. And so there's more and more research about how trauma is affecting students even after grade level school. And so how the relationship is between trauma and higher education. You also can start to, if you're not familiar with trauma-informed pedagogy, which we'll talk about in our next panel, there's some information there about what does it look like? How do you know if you're already trauma-informed? Because many of us don't realize that we do things in our normal practice that are already helping to support students who may have suffered from trauma. And so if you are already kind of on the pathway, there's ways to kind of continue that work. And so this will talk about what are different stages of being a trauma-informed educator. How can you move from one level to the next level? You can take some kind of self-assessments and ask yourself in your curriculum, in your classroom, in your work setting, what things are you doing that are supporting students to feel empowered and to be resilient, and what things might you want to explore improving upon. And then when we get to the end, we just have some resources about how to make sure that your trauma-informed pedagogy isn't missing the important step of being anti-racist and focused on equity, as well as just if you yourself find that you need some resources, whether you're a student or whether you're a staff member, whether you're a faculty member, how to make sure you're taking care of yourself and you're not suffering from compassion fatigue. And then if you need to reach out for more resources, whether it's you just want to educate yourself some more, read some books, read some articles, or get direct help. There is help for anybody who needs it. It doesn't matter what age you are, it doesn't matter what you believe in. There is help out there. And we want everyone to know that whether you're trauma was long ago or it's recent, there is a chance that it could affect you. And so you definitely want to reach out for help if you need it in whatever way you feel comfortable. So there are just some resources, some local Baruch resources, some CUNY-wide resources, as well as some New York City resources that folks, and national resources that folks can feel free to tap into. And so if anyone has any other resources and you would want to share it with us so that we can share it with the community, please feel free to, I guess, Professor D'Souza, should they send them to you? And then you'll pass it on to me, and then I'll add it into the resource guide. We definitely want to make sure that this is a living document that folks can reference whenever they need.
Yes, thank you.
And I just realized I was not screen sharing, so you guys didn't see me as I was scrolling. So I apologize for that.
Oh, no, that was perfectly fine, because actually I think people were looking on themselves, and I think we shared it already, but I can just put it on now as well for one moment. Back to our website, if I can move to our website here. Resource guide, and there's a ton. I think people were looking through it, Sika, because I saw people's eyes moving a lot, and I want to take a moment and just maybe put some love in the chat for Sika. Use those emojis, and because this was really it took a long time and a lot of effort. And Sika, you're one of our students in the higher ed program, and I just have to say how appreciative I've been to work with you, and to know that that there's students like you who are, first of all, already working actually in a current school and going to continue and be an inspiration to others, because there was a lot of work to put that together, and I just wanted to say thank you. And I think people also here are really grateful for that, because this is a one-time thing that we're doing, but this guide is really useful, and I'm going to try and get it integrated into some of the pedagogy workshops and all that we're doing. So thank you again, Sika, for that. As we transition, I want to just highlight one point that Sika brought up, that, and then we're going to move on to our second panel. There's someone I'm going to put in the chat, Resma Monicum, who does a lot of work on racial trauma, and here is his website. And Sika mentioned at the end, as you all know, we focus on everything DEI related, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we also focus a lot, and some of the seminars and workshops are on anti-racism work in particular. In the spring, one of the big teach-ins we're going to have is on anti-racism pedagogy in particular. And so I just want to read out something that he has spoken about in the past, and it's about how trauma shows up for different individuals in different communities, and this links to a lot of what Dr. Amador had said. Trauma decontextualized in a person over time can look like personality. So we may be seeing things that we think are just different aspects of a person showing up or not showing up in certain ways, and that may be basically different manifestations of trauma. Trauma decontextualized in a family over time can look like family traits, and trauma decontextualized in a people over time can look like culture. And so I just wanted to kind of link that when we think about anti-racism work, and we think about recognizing how some groups, as Dr. Amador said, have been marginalized historically and oppressed in our country, to think about all of these things as we move forward now and think about our population at Baruch and our population at CUNY, and invite our next facilitator and speaker to the floor. So I am very, very pleased to introduce our next student facilitator, Stanzi. Come on over. I am going to have her say her last name. I practiced it yesterday a bit, and she gave me a lot of grace, but I'm going to try once, and then please, Stanzi, say your name as well. Stanzi Vicht.
That was great.
Okay, I've been practicing.
Not as challenging as it can be, so.
Stanzi is a graduate student pursuing her master's in mental health counseling at the Weissman School. She has completed courses in internal family systems therapy, Hakomi mindful somatic psychotherapy, and awakened awareness for adolescents and young adults. She is also trained as a Zendo project sitter to provide peer support for challenging psychological and psychedelic experiences. Stanzi is an advocate for research in psychedelic-assisted therapy and has volunteered at the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, North Star, and UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. And Stanzi is originally from Cape Town. She's here now, and appreciates how the creativity, humor, and love of nature in her culture has informed her outlook on the world. So welcome, Stanzi. We're so happy to have you here and in conversation. Yes, thank you, Christina, for the reminder in the chat. We did ask for some questions just before this for Dr. Amador. We will come back to that at the end of this panel. So please feel free to, as this panel is going on, add in your questions in the chat for Jean, Amaral, and then at the end we will have both of our speakers respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna and Jael. That was amazing. And the guide, Sika, who I'm definitely going to share that with people. Thank you for putting that together. I would love to introduce Jean Amaral. Jean has her master's in library sciences, and she's the associate professor and open knowledge librarian at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. Jean partners with faculty across disciplines to create active and engaging learning experiences for students using open knowledge practices such as open educational resources and Wikipedia editathons, which sounds very fun. Having taught information literacy as well as literature and composition for several years, Amaral strives for student-centered learning experiences with a focus on asset pedagogies, including culturally sustaining and trauma-informed pedagogy and universal design for learning. Thank you so much, Jean, for joining us here today.
Great to be here. Thanks, Stanzi.
I'd love if you could tell us what exactly is trauma-informed pedagogy?
Sure. Before I dive into that, just want to say thank you, Dr. D'Souza, for the invitation to spend some time with you today. I've already learned so much. Thank you, Dr. Amador, for such a great grounding in understanding trauma. Has set up the conversation that we're about to have just really perfectly. And Sika, thanks so much for all those resources. I'm definitely going to dive into those. I know I have more to learn on this, and I'll be sharing those out both in presentations with CUNY, but also on my own campus. So super appreciative. Before I talk about what trauma-informed education can be, I'd like to start with a poem and a quotation. So this is a poem by Miller Williams, and it's entitled Compassion. Have compassion for everyone you meet, even if they don't want it. What seems conceit, bad manners, or cynicism is always a sign of things no ears have heard, no eyes have seen. You do not know what wars are going on down there where the spirit meets the bone.
I love that. That's beautiful. I think it ties beautifully into the quote Anna gave about trauma decontextualizing a person over time can look like personality. Thank you.
Yeah, Stanzi, exactly. And certainly speaks to, I think, what was pointed out in the chat that Dr. Amador talked about in terms of behaviors that we interpret as difficult, that there's something else going on there. And I also would like to quote bell hooks, who I think if we just took everything bell hooks ever written and designed education around that, we're done. We're absolutely there. And that's my goal at BMCC. So the quote I would like to use is also from Teaching to Transgress. And it is, to teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. And so I think at its heart, trauma-informed education has that respect and care for the souls of our students and a recognition that there is nobody living under racial capital in the United States today, which has not implemented reparations or addressed so many societies. There is nobody living in this country that has not experienced trauma, all of us. So when we talk about trauma-informed education, we focus a lot on the students, as we should. We need to focus on ourselves as well, and all of the systems, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But so trauma-informed education, I do think does get to that very respect and caring for the soul. So basically it's grounded in love, a love of our students. And if you haven't read All About Love by Bell Hooks, I also recommend that. That's certainly, I think, a really important thing to bring to this conversation, is loving ourselves and loving our students. So I also really appreciate the work of Alex Chevron-Vanette. And she's an educator up in Vermont who has written a book called Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education. And there's a lot of great information on trauma-informed specifically. But Vinette's work brings an equity lens to that. So equity-centered trauma-informed, which I think is really important. And she really focuses on systems. At any rate, I do like her definition, which, she's not trying to make this the definition. This is just one. You'll see others as well. So Vinette writes, trauma-informed educational practices respond to the impacts of trauma on the entire school community and prevent future trauma from occurring. Equity and social justice are key concerns of trauma-informed educators as we make changes in our individual practice, in classrooms, in schools, and in district-wide and statewide systems. So I really like how she captures just the range that absolutely we need to think about ourselves. We need to look at what we're doing in our classes, but it's so much bigger than that, right? And also, I do want to say what it is not, what trauma-informed education, and sometimes it's called trauma-informed education or trauma-informed teaching and learning or trauma-informed practices. What it is not, it does not mean that we are addressing trauma that our students may have experienced directly necessarily, right? We are not counselors, we are not therapists. So we're not here to diagnose our students. We just assume that all of us walk into that room having experienced trauma. And then what it does is look at the things that Dr. Amador pointed out in terms of bringing that lens. And Vinette talks about this as well, that this is a lens, not a label. And so we want to bring that lens of knowing that the behaviors we're witnessing, the struggles we see our students going through are likely related to, among one of many things, probably related to potential trauma that student has experienced. And certainly in the past couple of years, it's not just the individual trauma in terms of experiences, but also that societal level that Dr. Amador talked about as well. When we think about the pandemic, when we think about the racial violence, not that that wasn't happening all the time already, right? But certainly came into great focus more recently. And it also does not mean that we see the students as lacking. If a trauma-informed focus can very easily turn into a deficit-based approach by assuming, oh, the poor student, and there's a lack there that we have to address. That's not what this is about. This is actually an asset-based approach where we see a resilient, beautiful person in front of us who can learn if we consider what it means to learn while being human beings who have experienced trauma. So I'll leave it there, I think.
That's beautiful. And I love the asset-based approach and this being a lens, not a label. It's a great framework going into this discussion. It's so evident by the way that you talk and by reading your bio, just your passion for education and particularly trauma-informed pedagogy. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you got into this work.
Sure. So I have taught several years literature and composition. And when I burned out on that, I ended up in librarianship and back in higher education. So as an instructor, this really speaks to me. And as a librarian, I do a lot of faculty development work around open educational practices. And at BMCC, our work in the open education or open knowledge ecosystem is really grounded in pedagogical concepts. So we don't start with, what's an open educational resource, what's an OER. We start with what's happening in the classroom and how can we bring pedagogical knowledge and knowledge about how people learn into the classroom. So I've had for several years now, as I worked in that area, a focus on asset-based pedagogies. And that can be culturally sustaining pedagogies. For those who have read Django Paris and H. Samuel Leem's work, they have a collected volume, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies, which is fabulous for thinking about our students and what we're doing in the classroom. They also, that could be universal design for learning, thinking about all the different ways we learn, the different formats, and providing space for agency for students to make choices in their own education. And it can be open pedagogy, where students, we give the opportunity and the space for students to be knowledge creators rather than just knowledge consumers. And along with all of those asset-based pedagogies, bringing in trauma-informed certainly was relevant before the pandemic, but absolutely critical once we left campus and we were all faced with that pandemic. And so our community really their interest in it increased greatly at that time. I also bring a background in contemplative practices in higher education and in education. And I think contemplative practices work really well with a trauma-informed approach, both for ourselves and for our students. I loved Dr. D'Souza starting with grounding us to be present and just slowing down. We're often like little hamsters on a wheel, and it can be hard to just breathe. Breathing can be hard. Absolutely. And I do want to say, I didn't mention up top, but we're not okay, right? I think we all know that we're just not okay at this point. And we're seeing it at our school at BMCC. Our faculty are not okay. Our students are not okay. So those contemplative practices, that's slowing down, that breathing, that's compassion. Certainly a lot of contemplative practices about compassion for ourselves and others is just so crucial right now. It is so clear for us at BMCC. It's a struggle. It's a struggle to breathe. It's a struggle to get up in the morning. It's a struggle when your technology doesn't work to not sob at your desk. I was thinking about Dr. Amador's, I loved the graphic about the zones of stress. And I'm definitely not in my optimal arousal zone several times during the day. Definitely, and certainly technology really quickly gets me out of that optimal zone when it's not working. And I do think the trauma of the past couple of years certainly has affected how often we stay in that optimal zone and how often we go out. So, so this practice has been really important with my faculty that I work with during faculty development. And I think really crucial going forward with education, if we are going to ground ourselves and the philosophy and practice of bell hooks and these other asset pedagogies, trauma-informed absolutely should be right up front.
Great, thank you so much. I've definitely felt that in our Masters of Mental Health Counseling program, there's much more of a focus on incorporating trauma in the classroom than I saw in my prior undergrad degree. And I can feel the difference from the educators. There's so much more room for different experiences. Could you share some specific strategies for taking a trauma-informed pedagogical approach inside and outside of the classroom?
Sure. So I am going to throw out a couple, and I'm hoping y'all will have some discussions when we do breakout rooms as well, because I know there's a lot of knowledge in this room. And I would encourage anybody who wants to add to this in the chat right now, please do. I know there's lots of knowledge in this room, and I think it was Sika who said, you know, you're probably engaging in trauma-informed practices and just may not know it, right? So I'm sure you are. So feel free to contribute there. So there are a couple of different frameworks for thinking about trauma-informed practices in the classroom. One is from Vanette, who I mentioned, and she has 6 principles that are sort of bigger picture systems, but she also has 4 proactive priorities that she asks us to think about. And one is this predictable? So it is really, really helpful when we are stressed, when we have experienced trauma, to have things be predictable, because it is our executive functioning. I love that question, and I can't wait for Dr. Amador to answer it. By the way, the question about the things like ADHD and other implications there, right? The executive functioning with trauma and those other neurodiverse things. But that predictability can be really helpful. So to think about how you design your class, whether it's face-to-face or online, meeting in Zoom, or even if it's asynchronous, can you build in rituals? So if you're meeting in Zoom or face-to-face, you know, can you co-curate a music list, a playlist, so that every time the class starts, the first few minutes as your students come in, there's music playing. And extra points if it is co-curated and it's not just your list that the students actually get to choose. Maybe every class, before the class, one of the students is designated the DJ, and that student is playing music as the students come in. So, and that gets to another of the points in just a minute, but predictability, rituals can be really helpful in grounding. So it's just one example in terms of how we start a course, being really intentional, how we start each class, being really intentional about the choices that we're making. Is it flexible? So sure, you start your class every time with music, but maybe after the election on Tuesday next week, you come in and you don't necessarily want to play music because there's a little stress there. We don't know what's going to happen. And so maybe you need to shift it up a little bit. So there, to have that flexibility within that structure, within that predictability, to be able to be flexible can be very helpful as well. Does it foster empowerment? So do we create space for students to co-create our classes with us, for students to contribute, for students to feel ownership in our classes with us? And that can be big or small. That can be like having a student be the DJ, or it could be bigger, like we do the reading list for the first couple of weeks of class, but then students create the reading list for the class after that, given some direction about the kinds of things that would be appropriate. So you can co-create in big ways and co-create in small ways. And then the last one is, does it foster connection? So certainly thinking about that, the co-curated list for music. And does it create connection, not just with us? We don't have to be the person that solves everything or makes everything okay, right? That's not our role either. Connection with their the students' peers in the class are as important as their connection with us. So to create situations to create intentional activities to create that community and to have students connecting can be really important as well. So those are a few, one last example. So I talk to faculty all the time about course design as self-care. And this is a really important concept, especially now when a lot of us are feeling overwhelmed, really being intentional about our course design. So as an example, one of our faculty members into the pandemic just looked at her reading list and she's like, whoa, this is a lot for me, let alone my students, right? Our courses tend to, through accretion over time, have more and more things put in and not as many taken out. And so to think about what is at the core, what is the center, what is the big question, and what are the pieces that are going to address that are absolutely essential. So what can be pared back that would allow, given our own trauma and given our students, and considering everything Dr. Amador said, would allow us to engage in really meaningful ways. And she found the learning was as deep, if not deeper, when she took readings out and really picked ones that got to exactly what she felt her students needed. And another area of course design is self-care. One of the biggest stressors and one of the biggest traumatic experiences all throughout K through 16 is grading. Grading is violence. It absolutely is violence. And you're hearing more and more conversations around CUNY and also nationwide. There is a book by Judy Bloom, BLUM, called Ungrading, which is a collection of work. And again, this can happen in small ways and big ways. We have some of our faculty only place a grade at the end. There's no grading throughout the entire semester. It's only feedback that the students are getting. So there's many, many different ways to ungrade. But while that helps the students greatly, it also helps us. I never see our faculty more stressed than the point at which they have to engage in grading. And I know when I see the ungraders on campus, because during finals week, they're all so relaxed. They're totally chill. And then our other faculty are just like, whoa. So I encourage you to think about exploring this idea of course design as self-care and choices that you're making that care for yourself and end up caring for your students and are trauma informed as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And some of what you discussed relates to the individual professors and students. Could you speak a little bit about the systematic issues related to trauma?
Yeah, and I want to couch this in thinking about our systems, higher education, and CUNY in particular, in each of our individual campuses. I do not think it's enough to have these conversations just with faculty and just about what's happening in the classroom. That is absolutely essential and critical, but this needs to happen at the systemic level. And I think Alex Chevron-Vanette does a really great job of this. She's more focused on K through 12, but you can easily see the parallels with higher education. And so we need to be thinking about policies And also the systems, even just students coming into our buildings. You know, the first impression on pretty much every CUNY campus is a carceral institution. We all have to get through security. That does not feel safe. That does not feel warm. That does not feel welcoming. So there's one example of a system level issue that we could work on together, advocate, organize, and make change around. It's also around other practices. In our institution, when our students are on academic probation, talk about carceral language, let's change academic probation to something else. When our students are on academic probation, we ask them to perform their trauma to get readmitted. They have to write up a thing that says, you know, this is what I experienced, this is why I should be able to come back. We ask them to perform their trauma for us so that they can come back to their education. So again, systems that we could consider and somehow change. And also, there is trauma in how we interact with each other on campuses. If we think about faculty and staff and faculty and administration, and our staff is really struggling as well. And so to think about our relationships and applying that at the system level is so important. So not only to think about trauma-informed practices specifically about teaching and learning and pedagogy, but to think about those practices as we relate to each other on all sorts of levels within our institutions. And I don't think I need to tell you, I'll give you one example, actually. I know you've experienced this and you probably have tons of other examples, but here's one way the system traumatized faculty, and that was during the pandemic. When they had the money and the option to decrease the number of students in classes, they did not. And on many campuses, they increased the number of students in classes. That was absolutely traumatizing. And they could have made a decision otherwise that would have been much, much better for our faculty and for our students. All of the classes, the minute we went off campus and didn't come back and the pandemic continued, all of our class sizes should have been immediately reduced. And that's a trauma-informed practice that didn't happen. So I'll stop there because I know we want to go into breakout rooms. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jean. This was incredible. I can see that the chat going off with lots of support for what you said.
Yes, wonderful. I will take that cue from Eugene because you really covered a lot here and I appreciate it. And Sanzi, thank you so much. You've disappeared. There you are. Thank you so much for that. So as Jean mentioned, we are going to go off into breakout rooms, but just before that, I'm going to give just a little bit of time for the Q&A that had come up in the chat, and I'm sure some more will come up during your breakout sessions. For those of you to run, thank you so much. I appreciate you all being here. I know that our guests appreciate it as well. And the rest of this will be recorded. And so you'll get to hear more of the resources. So a couple of questions that had come up. First, Dr. Ryan, our dean, who I think she may have just had to leave, but she was here with us until just now. So she asked, what are some techniques for dealing with the hypo condition? So, you know, Dr. Amaral, not Dr. Amaral, sorry. Amador.
Jael.
Sorry. Jael. I know. I was trying to do the doctor and then I went to the Amaral. Okay. So Jael, can you please tell us a little bit about that? Just for ourselves also, just for knowing what, and with our students, you know, some breathing and Jean had just mentioned, you know, the kind of contemplative practices and bring those into our spaces.
Absolutely. So in general, when we think about hyperarousal, we want to think about slowing down, and hypoarousal, we want to think about speeding up or movement, right? So we do things to slow down, like breathing or meditation practices or things like that to bring us out of hyperarousal. Similarly, we can, when we're in hypoarousal, we can encourage students through breathing to experience the movement of their body when they're breathing, right? We can encourage physical movement. I mean, we can also encourage connection through things like relationship, through things like art practices. So what that can look like in the classroom is doing some sort of artwork within the classroom, doing some sort of group work within the classroom that's healing. But But that's just to kind of like say, just in general, thinking about when it's the hypo condition, thinking about movement and speeding up. And movement doesn't have to be like running sprints. It could be like focusing on your breathing and how your body moves when you breathe.
Right. No, I so appreciate that. And I just want to link to one thing that Jean had said earlier, which is, just being really thoughtful and mindful with the decisions we're making. And for me, that was the largest learning, the umbrella of my learning in pedagogy has been that we make all these decisions every day as professors, right? How we show up, everything from what we choose to put on the syllabus, how, as you mentioned, Jean, when you walk in, to a CUNY versus walking into a classroom, right? What do I look like when I see my students? Am I smiling at them? Am I warm? Am I welcoming, or am I taking out my bad day on that, whatever I'm feeling? The question is really about, self-care and then demonstrating that to them and then welcoming them. And so I love that you described a couple of these practices, Jael, that really help students within the classroom, regardless of the course and content, right? And I think that's what's really important here, that no one in the chat yet has brought up, like, what about with my course and when do I have time? And that's something that we always hear, right? How are we going to build this time in? And I guess the question is, is that a responsibility of ours, right? As professors, and that is a question that is very subjective, and I appreciate Jael giving those specific examples. Right, there was a recent discussion I was in with some people who someone had suggested an activity. You mentioned art just now as an example, or something that was kind of what one would consider fun, let's say, right? And this is a professor who's teaching graduate students, and asked, if it makes sense to do this sort of fun activity with graduate students. And I guess I'm kind of throwing this back to you for a moment, Jael, just to maybe talk about a little bit more about how in the moment, those things, this may not take an hour, right? And that's if you could just kind of talk about that a little more. I myself have read a little bit about this, given that I tend to be more on the up part of my hyper arousal, and that could be with stress, but that could also be with excitement, and so if you can just speak to us about how much time some of these things could maybe take.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it really depends, right? But they could take as little as 5 to 10 minutes to help our students connect, right? We did something very similar in the very beginning, right? It was about disconnecting from the things that we did before, perhaps disconnecting from our thoughts, disconnecting from the things that are kind of occupying us or making us feel unsafe, and to be able to connect in the here and now and the space. That doesn't have to take up a lot of time. That can take 5 to 10 minutes. I mean, it really depends on the person, but in terms of you incorporating that into your classroom, you can do it as much or as little as you want. It's just, I think it's about the practice. Practice tends to build on itself, right? And if we do that regularly, we can kind of build a practice of helping our students understand that our rooms, that our classrooms are safe spaces. And as we give that more to the students, they'll be able to like more relax their bodies as they come into our spaces.
Right, a little bit of muscle memory.
A little bit of muscle memory, yeah.
Right, also just kind of, right, so, okay, great. I'm putting right now in the chat, Jael, for you, one question from Christina Balboa, who is the chair of our DEI committee, and I'll read it out for you. In thinking about the examples you've given, does trauma impact executive functioning in a different way than other conditions like neurodiversity? And you can see the rest of it, yeah.
Yeah. So trauma and other conditions of neurodiversity, like you mentioned, ADHD, oftentimes have, well, not oftentimes, they have so many overlapping symptoms that sometimes it's really difficult to tease them apart. And one of the conversations that is happening in the field is that sometimes when we're trying to figure out what is really going on for a client, sometimes we delay treatment because we're so busy testing and trying to understand. So one of the ways, one of the conversations is that, yes, they impact executive functioning almost in the exact same way. There are some differences, right? Particularly when it comes to trauma, there's this element of dissociation. There's this element of re-experiencing trauma that's not associated with ADHD, but the ways in which we treat them or support them can still be the same. Things like including mindfulness practices, including organization practices, including challenging negative thoughts, are both helpful in the treatment of trauma and the treatment of ADHD. Neurobiologically, like you can't tell a difference from a brain scan, right? They typically look the same, and they oftentimes have very, very similar kind of symptomatology. One of the ways we can kind of tease them apart is like, when did these issues with executive functioning start, right? So if a student is saying in college, like, I think I have ADHD because I was an A student and now I'm not, right? We have to start thinking about like, this is probably not ADHD. This is probably a traumatic experience that is impacting their functioning.
Right. I appreciate that. Thank you. And what I'm hearing is also that there's so much nuance here, right? I mean, that's the reality that we, like I said in the beginning, I gravitated towards this topic actually because during the pandemic, Jean, maybe I guess Jean, you started during the pandemic to give these sessions CUNY wide, and in reading about that and reading about my own personal connections with some of this. I think, how do I say, as they always say, the devil is in the details, right? And so like, each individual is special in that sense. We're each unique. And so while our symptoms may look similar to others, and while some of the practices that you mentioned may help others, at the end of the day, it's really unique, right? And it happens to be with those students who show up in your classroom in that particular semester, and then it's one-on-one with that particular student who needs the additional support. And so thank you so much for that, Jael. Now we are going to transition to breakout rooms for just about a little less than 15 minutes. And what we are going to be doing is, well, what you are going to be doing together is answering the following question. Jean had mentioned this to you already. And the question is really about what you're also doing and what we, oh, thank you. I think someone's going to put in the check, but I got it, Sika. Or maybe Sika's already beaten me to it. Here's the, thank you, Sika. So what would community care look like for you at Baruch, right? In your office, in your classroom, in your department, in your service activities. So here we're broadening the lens. Instead of just thinking about our students, which many of us are instructors in this room, we were thinking about them. Many of us in this room are staff who are student facing. And so of course, we've got the focus of our students. But what we're learning is, of course, a lot of us have experienced trauma and continue in many ways to experience trauma here in our country. And so what does community care look like? What does it look like to show up for yourself, to show up for each other? And so I'm going to start these breakout rooms right now. They'll be quite small. They're basically 2 to 3 people. And what we would love you to do is just talk about actually, this question or whatever else kind of spoke to you from today's session, and think about kind of what you'll be taking away from this session, right? I'll let you know when we're about halfway there, and I'll welcome you back in about 12, 13 minutes. Thanks. So please join the rooms, and for whatever reason, if you don't feel like joining a room, you just feel like chilling and hanging out, that's okay too. Please feel comfortable doing that as well. Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. Thank you so much for spending that time together in community and breakout rooms. We are going to just have 1 or 2 minutes in closing here. There were a couple of questions in the chat that we didn't get to answer, so I would just like to invite Dr. Amador to speak to the question in the chat about, intergenerational trauma, just to kind of mention kind of maybe what it is and how that connects to the other traumas you talked about. And then Jean, in a moment, I'm going to come back to you for that other question by Dr. Beeman. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So intergenerational trauma refers to patterns of trauma that we see in families going back, like our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and things that tend to keep repeating themselves. And they can look very different, right? So to answer this question, it really depends on how intergenerational trauma manifests itself, whether it be through mental illness, whether it be through violence, right, interpersonal, whether it be through violence in community, which could be community trauma, or but I think this is a really great way, really great example of how all trauma is societal trauma and institutional trauma, right? Because it can manifest in multiple different ways on multiple different aspects of trauma sources. And if we look back on any sort of intergenerational trauma, any sort of pattern in a family that's been going on for generations, we can often trace it back to oppression, right? So it's like in the United States, right? intergenerational trauma within families, particularly within Black families, can often be traced back to trauma related to the transatlantic slave trade, right? And so I guess to answer that question is, where would we place it on the chart? It would really depend on how it manifests individually, but I think it's just an example of how all trauma relates to how we as a society view people and how we oppress people and how we continue those patterns of oppression.
Great. Thank you so much. And Jean, I'll welcome you in to answer this last question. Dr. Newman, so you already read it. Yeah.
Yeah. Angie, thanks so much for posing that question. I feel like it almost needs its own seminar discussion outside. We focus so much on the students and thinking about how we present when we bring in and when we come into the classroom and how that affects, I think, is so important. I do think applying or thinking about reflecting on the information that Dr. Amador presented, and then also about practices that are helpful for students to think about how they apply to ourselves as well as instructors going in. And I think especially being reflective, like, where is my trauma coming from? How is it affecting me? How is my executive functioning? And that course design as self-care gets a little bit at that, because it acknowledges that we're experiencing trauma, we're experiencing those cognitive effects, those physical effects as well. And so to be mindful and aware and curious and watch and reflect on what's happening in our classrooms. We had a little conversation while you all were in groups about, applying reflection across the curriculum, not only to having our students reflect on things, but also having us. So I think it does take time and attention to think about our classes after a class. What happened today? Was I present in a way that was compassionate, that brought trauma-informed practices, or was I bringing in other things that were affecting? And I think just increasing our knowledge wherever we can around the impacts of trauma on ourselves is really important. I also love My Grandmother's Hands as well. That was a book that was mentioned earlier for understanding trauma. So yeah, if we can continue to learn, we can continue to reflect. It's such an important part and point. And yeah, I'm looking forward to whoever first develops a little session that maybe can engage us in conversation around that, because I think it's a good one.
Thank you so much, Jean.
Yeah.
I was literally taking some deep breaths and thinking, what do I do right after my classes? I literally, I don't run literally, but I do walk very quickly to my classroom and do the next, right? And when they're on Zoom and when they've been on Zoom, I know so many people who teach and then they're off, they go to the next activity. And what you're, I think, describing is that moment of reflection for ourselves and that self-care for ourselves, even just transitioning to the next activity. And then maybe the next step, which is, as you mentioned, reflect on how we showed up, reflect on our practices, reflect on how we want to be better for ourselves and for our students and for the institutions we are in. Jael just mentioned kind of upholding or continuing how our society continues to oppress and marginalize many groups of people, and many of our students at BMCC and at Baruch come from those groups of people, and the question is, how can we be, as Jael put in the chat, revolutionary? How can we take that time back? How can we disrupt, the standard practice? So in that note, I will first begin by just thanking each and every one of you who are here as participants here today, as the audience. I want to thank Sika again for everything she's done to put together our resources and our website. I want to thank Daphne, who's no longer with us, but Stanzi, who's right here, as our two student facilitators. And I want to thank our lovely, lovely guests, Jean and Jael. I will use your first names because you are both colleagues, and I would consider you both actually friends. And I just really appreciate your time. This is such an important session. And please know that, we had maybe, something like 20 people here today, but this is going far. Okay, do not worry. I'm going to say thank you to you right now on who's watching, because I know there are people watching this, because I'm going to be sending it out, and this is going to continue to live out there in the ethers through YouTube. And so thank you to all of those who are watching today, and we really appreciate you being here at our trauma-informed pedagogy teach-in, as well as a DEI Friday. We hope to see you at the next DEI Friday, which is in 2 weeks, and it's going to be with our professor at the Mark School, Don Wiseman, and he's going to be talking about liberating structures and ways to do some of what we're talking about, which is shake up what we typically do. And he's going to be talking about that in the context of leadership and collaboration and making decisions in organizations. So I hope you will be able to join us then. Thank you. Bye.